That morning, Meredith decided to take Ella out for a hike. But instead of one of her usual spots, she chose something a bit different: Blood Mountain in Georgia. This wasn't her regular route. Blood Mountain was about 40 miles north of where she lived. But for Meredith, who craved the beauty and challenge of the trail, that probably made it all the more appealing. Before heading out, she scribbled a short note on the chalkboard in her apartment. It said, "Took Ella, went hiking." That was it. No mention of where exactly she was going, no estimated time of return. But that was nothing unusual. She often left notes like that, brief, casual. She wasn't the type to worry people with too much detail. That day, her roommate Julia had her own plans. She was out and about, spending time with friends. So when she came home that night and saw that Meredith wasn't back yet, it didn't set off any alarms. Meredith loved long hikes, and it wasn't unusual for her to be gone most of the day. But the next morning, something felt off. It was a work day for Meredith. And every morning before heading to her job, she had a little ritual. She would bring Ella into Julia's room so that Julia could watch over her while Meredith was gone. But on that morning, there was no knock on the door. No ella, no Meredith. Julia tried to stay calm. Maybe she'd overslept. Maybe she had dropped Ella off with someone else. Just in case, she walked over to Meredith's room to check on her, maybe give her a gentle nudge in case she was running late. But when she opened the door, the room was empty. Meredith's bed hadn't been slept in. Her hiking gear wasn't there. And Ella was gone too. She tried calling Meredith's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Still, Julia told herself maybe Meredith had already left for work. Maybe there was a change in routine. Maybe it was nothing. But then, just a few hours later, Julia's phone rang again. This time, it was someone from Meredith's workplace. Meredith hadn't shown up. They were wondering where she was. And that was when everything changed. This was not like Meredith. Not in the slightest. She wasn't the type to just not show up. She was responsible, always early to work, always dependable. Her friends knew it. Her family knew it. Julia knew it. And so the call started. Friends, family, all tried to reach her. But no one had heard from her. No one had seen her. And that's when they made it official. They reported Meredith Emerson as missing. Meanwhile, they all began their own search for her. The morning Meredith disappeared, she left behind just one small clue. Like I mentioned earlier, before she walked out the door with Ella, she'd written a short note on the chalkboard in her apartment. Just a simple message that she'd gone hiking. Nothing more. No mention of the trail she chose or how long she expected to be gone. That was typical of Meredith. She was independent, low maintenance, and never gave people a reason to worry. But now, that tiny note was the only lead anyone had. So her friends started thinking hard. If Meredith had gone hiking, where would she have gone? They knew she had a few favorite trails, but there were dozens around that area. They needed something more concrete. And then someone remembered a book Meredith kept in her bedroom. It was filled with different hiking routes and nature walks all across Georgia. She'd gone through it meticulously, circling, highlighting, marking the ones she hoped to try someday. It was almost like a wish list of adventures. So her friends grabbed the book, flipped through the pages she had marked, and used it as a roadmap to guide their search. They didn't waste time. They split into groups and got in their cars, driving to as many of those marked trails as possible. The idea was simple: cover as much ground as quickly as they could. It was a desperate, determined effort, born from love and fear. Every group took a different direction. Along the way, they spoke to park rangers, trail maintenance workers, anyone who might have seen a young woman with a black Labrador out on the paths that day. And then there was a breakthrough. One of Meredith's friends called Julia, and the words she said shifted everything. She'd found Meredith's car. It was parked at the base of Blood Mountain, in a small, quiet parking area. The windshield was dusted with a light layer of snow, undisturbed. That told them something chilling. Meredith hadn't returned. Her car had been sitting there for hours, maybe overnight. This was it, the first real lead. So everyone, her friends, her family, everyone who had scattered across the state to search, they all rerouted and gathered at Blood Mountain. That mountain now held all their hope and all their fear. Once again, they split up, fanning out across the many trails and paths that led up and around the mountain. The area was vast, wooded, rugged. But they searched anyway, calling Meredith's name, hoping for any sound of movement. Still, something about it all felt wrong. Her friends would later describe the same feeling, a sinking, quiet dread in their stomachs, like they were walking towards something they didn't want to find. The sun began to set, and the air started to change. Up on Blood Mountain, once darkness begins to fall, temperatures plummet fast, cold that bites through layers. Meredith had been gone the entire day now, and if she was just lost or even injured, time was quickly running out. She couldn't survive a night alone in those freezing conditions. They pushed forward, refusing to give up. They knew Meredith was strong, trained, fit, but even that had its limits in the wild. They kept searching until eventually they came across something. It wasn't Meredith, but it was something that made their hearts drop. Scattered along a portion of the trail were a few of her personal belongings. There were water bottles, a dog leash, some dog treats. At first glance, it might have looked like someone just dropped their pack in a hurry. But there was more. Among the items was a police baton. If you're unfamiliar, a police baton is a heavy, extendable metal rod, a weapon, essentially. It's carried by law enforcement, meant for defense or to restrain. Seeing it out there on the ground among Meredith's things didn't make sense. There was no reason she would have had something like that with her. And that raised a terrifying possibility. Maybe someone else had brought it. Maybe someone used it. Maybe it was used on her. The discovery painted a dark picture. The items on the ground were troubling on their own, but the earth around them told another part of the story. The ground was uneven, disrupted, like there had been a scuffle, a struggle, something violent, kicking, pulling, movement that wasn't natural to a hiking trail. Taken all together, the disturbed earth, the scattered belongings, the baton, it didn't look good. Not all. It was enough to push the investigation into high gear. Authorities now knew they couldn't treat this as just a missing persons case anymore. Something bad had happened here. So they set up a temporary police base at the foot of Blood Mountain. They brought in officers, search teams, and investigators. Now, the focus turned to gathering information. They hoped that maybe, just maybe, there was someone out there, a regular hiker or a local, someone passing through, who had been on the mountain that day. Someone who might have seen Meredith. As investigators set up their base at the foot of Blood Mountain and search teams continued combing the trails, reports slowly started to trickle in. Bits and pieces of sightings that, on their own, didn't mean much, but together, they began to paint a picture. A few different people came forward saying they'd seen a young woman with a black dog, a dog that looked a lot like Ella. The descriptions matched Meredith. Young, active, out on a hike with her loyal companion. These witnesses were hikers, locals, people who frequented the area and knew the terrain well. They said they remembered the woman not just because of the dog, but because she'd been speaking with someone, a man. Several of the witnesses mentioned the same thing, an older man, maybe in his 50s or 60s. But odd-looking, though no one could quite put into words what made him seem strange. There was just something about him that stood out, something off. Some said he had a dog too, though no one was sure of its breed. One witness, however, offered more than just a vague sighting. They remembered something very specific. They were almost certain they'd seen the man getting out of a white van earlier that morning. That detail, the van, changed everything. It gave the investigation a focal point. Something solid. Detectives began asking everyone in the area if they'd seen a white van recently. Was it familiar? Had anyone noticed it parked in the area before Meredith went missing? It was a long shot, but then someone stepped forward with what turned out to be a huge break. A local hiker said he'd been in the Blood Mountain parking lot the night before Meredith disappeared, and he remembered seeing a white van. Not only that, he had taken a photo of it. Just a random picture he'd snapped, maybe of the scenery, maybe of the lot. But in the background was the van. This wasn't hearsay. This was proof. Time-stamped. There, in black and white, a white van parked in the exact area where Meredith's car would be found the next day. That meant whoever drove it had been at Blood Mountain not just that day, but possibly the night before. Watching, waiting. It was horrifying to think about. That Meredith may have simply walked into someone's trap. That maybe this man had been there all along, lingering around that trailhead, waiting for someone who matched a certain description. And tragically, Meredith was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Armed with this lead, the police knew they had to move fast. They issued a public appeal, asking anyone who knew of a bald man, likely in his 50s or 60s, who drove a white van and owned a red-haired dog, to come forward. They even created a dedicated tip line, encouraging people to report anything, no matter how small, that might be connected to this man or this van. Time was now their enemy. If Meredith had been taken, every hour that passed was critical. Police believed, with increasing certainty, that they were no longer dealing with a missing hiker. This was an abduction, and Meredith was likely in danger. The media, too, became heavily involved in the case, much more so than in most missing persons cases. Typically, police are very cautious about going public with detailed suspect information. They worry that if a potential abductor sees himself being described in news coverage, down to the van, the dog, his physical features, it might push him to panic, to disappear, or worse, to harm the victim. Normally, police hold those cards close to the chest for that very reason. It's always a delicate balance, keeping the public informed without endangering the person you're trying to save. But in Meredith's case, for whatever reason, the police gave the media everything. As information came in, it was shared publicly. And while that can sometimes backfire horribly, this time it worked. Because within just a couple of days, that public appeal led to something big. The tip line was ringing constantly now, but one particular call stood out from the rest, the kind of call investigators quietly hope for but rarely get. A businessman called in, calm but serious, saying he believed he recognized the suspect the police had been describing. The bald man with the white van, the red-haired dog, the police baton. He said he was almost certain that the man they were searching for was someone he had once employed. A former worker who not only matched the physical description, age, build, balding head, but who also happened to be a regular at Blood Mountain. In fact, the caller said this man was known to spend a lot of time up there, hiking those trails alone, sometimes for hours at a time. But there was something else, something even more specific. The man always carried a police baton with him. Not for work, not for show, just always had it. It was such a peculiar and distinct trait that it caught everyone's attention immediately. The man the caller was referring to was 61-year-old Gary Hilton. When police ran his name through the system, they pulled up his driver's license and printed out his photo. They needed confirmation, something that could place him on the mountain the day Meredith went missing. So they returned to Blood Mountain, armed with the photograph, and began showing it to every hiker, every local, anyone who had been there that day. And then the answers came flooding in. Yes, that's him. That's the guy we saw. That's the man with the red-haired dog. That's the man talking to Meredith. That's the guy with the white van. The match was undeniable. With that confirmation, police didn't waste a second. They turned the entire case over to the media. Gary Hilton's name, his face, his details, all of it was broadcast across the country. News reports plastered his image everywhere. If he was watching the news, there was no question he knew they were coming for him. And then, something unexpected happened. The story reached Florida. Someone watching the news in Florida, someone who saw Gary's name and face, called in with a different concern. They weren't calling about Meredith. They were calling about another disappearance. It was about a woman named Cheryl Dunlap. She was 46 years old, and she had vanished just a month earlier. Cheryl was a well-known, well-loved figure in her Florida community. She worked at a local hospital and was deeply involved in her church. Every Sunday, without fail, she attended the same service and even taught a Bible class afterward. Her friend described her as dependable to a fault, kind, giving, and never one to flake out on a commitment. So when she didn't show up to church that Sunday morning, alarm bells went off immediately. People tried calling her, but there was no answer. That alone was worrying. Cheryl was the kind of person who would always call back, always explain. The silence was deafening. By Monday morning, the concern had grown. A group of her friends went to her house, hoping to find her and maybe get some answers. When they arrived, they found Cheryl's dog still inside, unfed, alone, clearly waiting. But her car was gone. That was odd. Cheryl usually left the dog at home when she went to work, so maybe she just headed to her shift to the hospital? But when her friends called her employer, they were told she hadn't turned up. No call, no message, nothing. That's when her friends contacted her family, and Cheryl Dunlap was reported missing. Not long after that, police got their first major clue. Cheryl's car was discovered parked along the side of a highway. Not just pulled over, it had actually been driven down a grass embankment, sitting in a spot that made no logical sense. At first, police considered the possibility that maybe Cheryl had suffered a flat tire and veered off the road. Sure enough, one of the tires was completely flat, but something about the scene didn't sit right. They took the vehicle in for inspection and soon realized that the flat tire wasn't an accident. It had been deliberately slashed, sabotaged, and that changed everything. Even more concerning was where the car had been found, right next to a massive stretch of forest. Over 57,000 acres of thick, dense wilderness. A place so vast and wild that the idea of conducting a full search seemed nearly impossible. Still, Cheryl's friends and family didn't hesitate. They organized search parties, printed flyers, and spread word across the community. Hundreds of people turned out to help. Some were on foot, others on horseback. They went into the forest, calling Cheryl's name, hoping for any sign. But no matter how determined they were, the truth was clear. They couldn't cover it all. The woods were too large, too deep, too unpredictable. And so, eventually, the search had to be called off. With Cheryl Dunlap officially missing and no significant progress in locating her, investigators began doing what they always do when someone vanishes without a trace. They looked into her life, her background, her relationships, her routines, anything that might offer a hint. But what they found was, honestly, quite the opposite of what you'd expect in a case like this. Cheryl seemed to live a genuinely happy, stable life. She had a job she loved, she worked at a hospital, and not only was it well-paying and secure, it was the kind of work that gave her purpose. She had 2 adult sons and a young grandchild, all of whom she adored. She was deeply involved in her church community, attending every Sunday without fail and teaching a Sunday school class afterward. Her friend described her as compassionate, devoted, and incredibly dependable. She had a network of people who cared for her. She was well-liked. She had structure. She had joy. When police tried to find red flags, there were barely any. The only thing that stood out, if you could even call it that, was that Cheryl had gone through a divorce some years back. But it wasn't recent, and there had never been any indication of lingering tension. It had been settled peacefully with enough time and space afterward that it no longer felt relevant. She wasn't seeing anyone new either. No boyfriends. No complicated relationships. No signs of anyone in her life who might want to hurt her, or any reason Cheryl would want to leave everything behind, which made her disappearance all the more chilling. Then, 4 days after Cheryl was last seen, police started digging into her financial records. They needed to know if her accounts were still active, if maybe someone was trying to use them. And sure enough, there it was, activity. Her bank card had been used at the same ATM machine 3 separate times since she'd gone missing. Each time, the same amount had been withdrawn, $700 in cash. That kind of precision, that repetition, it felt calculated. Police immediately went to pull the security footage from that particular ATM. What they saw confirmed their worst fear. It wasn't Cheryl making the withdrawals. It was a man, and he had gone out of his way to hide his face. He wore clothing that obscured his features, kept his head down, and made sure no defining characteristics were visible. Obviously, that raised major red flags. Police made a plan. They decided to stake out that ATM location, hoping the man might come back again to pull another $700. Officers stayed hidden, watching and waiting, ready to move the moment he returned. But he never did. That lead, like so many others in Cheryl's case, dried up. And so, the search continued. Week after week, Cheryl's friends and family held on to hope. Flyers were posted. People were out walking through neighborhoods, knocking on doors, asking questions. But with each passing day and no new information, it became more and more apparent that this wasn't going to end with Cheryl just turning up. The most terrifying part? That massive forest beside the road where her car had been found. 57,000 acres of untamed wilderness. There was no way to search all of it. Still, that didn't stop the people who loved her from trying. Small groups continued going out into the woods on foot, doing what they could. Some brought trained dogs. Some rode horses to cover more ground. Everyone wanted to find something, anything, but eventually reality set in. They couldn't keep searching forever. They didn't have the resources. The forest was too large. And so the official search was called off. But then, 2 weeks after Cheryl had disappeared, a grim discovery was made. 2 hunters were out in that same stretch of woods, not far from where Cheryl's car had been abandoned. They weren't searching for her. They were simply training their dogs to become hunting dogs. While they were walking, they noticed something unusual in the sky. A vulture circling above a specific patch of forest. Vultures don't circle randomly. They gather when there's something dying or dead. Curious, and maybe sensing something wasn't right, the hunters followed its path and moved toward the area. And that's when they saw it, a body lying on the forest floor. It was a woman, but the scene was gruesome. She was missing both her head and her hands. Whoever had done this had gone to extreme lengths to make sure this person couldn't be identified. No dental records, no fingerprints. It was clearly murder. And not just murder, but one that was cold, calculated, and deliberate. Still, the clues around her spoke volumes. The body was found just a short distance from where Cheryl Dunlap's car had been discovered. She had been missing for 2 weeks. The timeline fit. The location fit. The gender matched. They couldn't be sure. Not yet. But the implication was horrifyingly clear. Police collected a DNA sample from the body and compared it to a sample taken from Cheryl's toothbrush. It was her. The woman in the woods was Cheryl Dunlap. So I realized that was a big diversion from the timeline. So just to bring it back, Meredith Emerson has been missing for a few days. They have a suspect named Gary Hilton that they're trying to find. And someone had just called in thinking that Gary Hilton might be responsible for Cheryl's murder. But Gary Hilton wasn't just being looked into for Meredith and Cheryl. By now, investigators have begun to realize they might be dealing with something far bigger than a missing person or even a single murder. In fact, there was a third case, actually a double homicide, that had drawn the attention of police in North Carolina. And the pieces were starting to connect in a deeply disturbing way. That case involved an elderly couple, John and Irene Bryant, a quiet, loving pair who had spent most of their lives in New York raising a family. They had poured their energy into parenting, into work, into doing everything they were supposed to do. And once they retired, with their children all grown and building families of their own, they decided it was time to follow their hearts. John and Irene had always been adventurous. They weren't the type to sit still or slow down in retirement. They loved nature, always had. Long hikes, remote camping trips, backpacking around Europe and New Zealand. These weren't once-in-a-lifetime dreams for them. This was how they lived. John even once completed a 2,000-mile hike stretching all the way from Georgia to Maine. That tells you everything you need to know about how deeply they were connected to the outdoors. So when they decided to leave New York behind, they looked for somewhere that offered what they loved most: the mountains, the woods, the trails. They found it in North Carolina. After moving, they kept up with their routine. It wasn't unusual for John and Irene to go out hiking several times a week, sometimes for a few hours, sometimes for several days. It was just part of their rhythm. And on one ordinary day in October 2007, they headed out to explore a new trail. Just a day hike. Nothing major. Something they'd done 100 times before. But this time, they didn't come back. At first, no one noticed. Their children were spread across different states, living their own lives. Like many families, they stayed connected over the phone, checking in now and then. And when John and Irene didn't answer the first few calls, it wasn't alarming. Maybe they were out running errands. Maybe they were in the middle of one of their hikes or away camping for the weekend. It had happened before. But after several days, concerns started to set in. Calls kept going unanswered. Messages weren't returned. A week passed, then a week and a half. Still nothing. No movement. No sign. Their kids, who had grown up watching their parents fall in love with the wilderness, began to feel something they hadn't before: fear. By the time 2 full weeks had gone by, The silence had become unbearable. One of their sons, who lived in Texas, decided he couldn't take it anymore. He got on a plane and flew out to North Carolina. When he arrived at his parents' home, the first thing he noticed was the newspapers. Dozens of them, stacked and scattered across the front porch. 2 weeks' worth of deliveries untouched. That wasn't like them. He knocked on the door. No answer. He banged. Still nothing. He called their phones, but they didn't ring from inside the house. There was no movement, no light, just stillness. He made the decision to break in. Inside the home, things were eerily normal, and that made it worse. In the kitchen, 2 breakfast bowls sat on the table. The food inside had long since spoiled. It looked like someone had set them out expecting a normal day, and then never returned to eat. That's when he knew something was wrong. Deeply wrong. Desperate for answers, he borrowed a rental car and began retracing every possible place his parents might have gone. Every hiking trail, every forest entrance. He drove, hoping to spot something, anything. Then he did. He pulled into a small parking lot at the entrance of a hiking trail. And there, tucked in the lot, was his parents' car. His heart must have dropped. He immediately called the local sheriff's office and reached out to park rangers. Within hours, a full search team was combing the woods. It didn't take long. Just 30 meters into the trees, a distance their son could have covered in minutes, maybe seconds, police found a body. It was Irene Bryant. Her body was so close to the car that if her son had walked just a bit farther into the woods, he would have found her himself, which is a terrifying thought. When investigators found Irene Bryant's body just a few steps into the woods, the immediate question was obvious. Where was John? The couple had gone hiking together. They were always together. If Irene had been found murdered, where had John gone? Or more likely, what happened to him? A physical search was launched immediately, stretching across miles of rugged trails and forest land. On the ground, officers, volunteers, and park rangers worked around the clock, navigating thick brush, steep inclines, and narrow ravines. In the sky, helicopters scanned from above. On the ground, dogs tracked for scent, riders patrolled on horseback, and vehicles combed the roads. But there was no sign of John. Not his body, not his clothing, not even a trace of blood or a dropped item. Meanwhile, back at the station, investigators were focusing on the digital side of things, tracking any activity tied to the Bryant's names. That's when they discovered something chilling. While Irene was already confirmed to be deceased, her bank card had been used multiple times, an ATM in Tennessee. They reviewed the footage, hoping for some miracle of clarity. And there he was, not John Bryant, but a man using her card, his face intentionally covered. He knew exactly what he was doing, hiding his identity as he took out cash from the account of a murdered woman. This development pushed everything into overdrive. Appeals were made on the news. Posters were printed. A $10,000 reward was offered for any information. But despite all of that, there were no breakthroughs, no solid leads, no confirmed sightings of John Bryant. The search pressed on for weeks, but eventually the trail went cold. And it probably would have stayed that way. A painful, unsolved mystery, if not for the unfolding case of Meredith Emerson. At this point, Meredith had only been missing for a few days. Hope was still alive. Maybe she was injured. Maybe she was lost. Maybe she'd still be found. But the name Gary Hilton was becoming more and more unsettling, especially when detectives started realizing how much he resembled the man seen with Meredith on the trail. And when they dug deeper into his past, what they uncovered made them pause. They circled back to Hilton's former boss, the same man who'd initially called in the tip. This time, they weren't just asking for a name and a photo. They wanted to understand who Gary Hilton really was. His former boss described him as a loner, someone who never really connected with others. He didn't socialize, didn't have close friends. He didn't talk about anything, not family, not relationships. All he ever seemed to care about was work and hiking. He would go out into the wilderness for days at a time with his dog, a red-haired canine named Dandy. He loved that dog more than anything. It was like the one bond he truly valued. But more than that, Hilton seemed to genuinely enjoy the solitude. He didn't like people, and the more time passed, the more his boss started to notice troubling changes in him. Gary was becoming angrier, unstable. He'd come back from hikes complaining about confrontations he'd had with other dog owners, how they were doing it wrong, how they didn't treat their animals properly. Hilton believed there was a right way to own a dog, his way, and if someone didn't meet that standard, he'd lash out, sometimes verbally, sometimes physically. So now, the police were looking at a man who not only had a history of aggressive outbursts on hiking trails, but who seemed to seek out confrontation in the very places their victims had gone missing. And it didn't stop there. The boss explained that in early 2007, Hilton had started slipping at work. He wasn't showing up. He was late, distracted, inconsistent. Eventually, the boss went to Hilton's home to check on him. And what he found was shocking. The house was in total disarray, garbage strewn everywhere. Hilton himself was unkempt, unshowered, eyes hollow. When he smiled, the boss noticed something even more disturbing. Many of Hilton's teeth were missing. This was a man who, up until recently, had a full set of teeth. Concerned, the boss asked what had happened. Hilton answered, and it left him stunned. He said he'd pulled them out himself, with pliers, not because of a medical issue, but because, and these were his words, it freaked people out. And that amused him. That was it, the final straw. The boss let him go. Hilton was clearly not stable, mentally or emotionally, and he was no longer capable of holding a job. But being fired didn't sit well with Hilton. Not all. He became threatening. He told his former boss he was going to kill him. And given everything, the tooth removal, the violent outbursts, the descent into something darker, the threat felt very, very real. His former boss started carrying a gun for protection. And not long after, he reported Hilton to the police. But Hilton must have gotten wind of it somehow. Maybe the police paid him a visit. Maybe someone tipped him off. Because within 2 days, Hilton had packed up everything he owned into his van and disappeared. And that's when police started looking into his past even more thoroughly. They found he had a criminal record, not for violent crimes, but for things like petty theft, scams, drug possession. Nothing major on paper, but there was a pattern, a consistency in his justifications. So, investigators reached out to someone who had defended Hilton more than once, his lawyer. Not just any lawyer, a man who also happened to be an old friend of Hilton's, someone who'd known him well in the past. And they weren't friends at the present time during this case. His name was Sam, a man who lived a rather unusual double life. By day, Sam was a practicing lawyer, calm, methodical, professional. But by night, he pursued something very different. He was an independent filmmaker, a budget-level producer who had a deep love for horror and psychological thrillers. His style wasn't about splatter or gore. He preferred the kinds of stories that mess with your head, that get your heart racing and keep you on edge. Tension over terror. Suspense over shock. Back in 1985, long before Meredith Emerson's case would surface, Sam had worked on one particular film project that stood out, not just because of the storyline, but because of who he made it with. His co-producer, co-writer, and creative partner on that project was none other than Gary Hilton. The film was called Deadly Run. The premise? A group of men who would seduce, manipulate, or befriend women, lure them into the woods, tie them up, and then let them run. Not to escape, not to survive, but to be hunted like animals, like prey. It was a disturbing idea, even as fiction. And yet, Hilton wasn't just involved in the project. He was completely immersed. He worked on the script, helped cast the actors, handled directing, producing, you name it. Sam described him as deeply creative when it came to the genre. Hilton had a natural eye for horror. He was inventive, focused, even talented. But there was a darker side. While Sam wanted the film to focus on psychological suspense, Hilton kept pushing for more intensity. He wanted more blood, more violence. He tried to add explicit scenes, rape scenes, even scenes that went far beyond what Sam was comfortable with. Scenes that didn't just thrill, they disturbed. Sam pushed back, repeatedly. Eventually, they found a middle ground and completed the film. It never became a major success, just a low-budget project that disappeared into the fringes of horror cinema. But looking back, it was deeply unsettling, because what had once seemed like just a dark imagination for the sake of storytelling now felt like something else entirely. Years after Deadly Run, their friendship fell apart, not over creative differences, but over something far more bizarre. Gary Hilton stole Sam's dog. One day, Sam came home from work and his dog, who had been in the yard, was gone. Vanished. Posters were made. Calls were made. Days passed. A full week went by. Then someone casually told Sam, "Hey, I think Gary Hilton has your dog." And that was it. To this day, it's unclear whether Sam tried to get the dog back or just let it go. Maybe he was too afraid of what Hilton might do. Maybe he just didn't want to escalate things with someone he now saw as unstable. Either way, the friendship was dead, and the memory of that stolen dog just lingered. A strange, eerie footnote to a man whose mind was clearly unraveling. It feels weird to just move on from that, to say he stole a dog and then continue the timeline, but honestly, that's all there is to say. He stole a dog. I don't even know what went on. Anyway, 3 days into Meredith Emerson's disappearance, police were desperately following every possible lead. Hilton's name was everywhere. His face was on every television screen, on every news alert. Georgia's most wanted man. And then, something completely unexpected happened. Gary Hilton called his former boss. Yes, the same boss who had helped police identify him. The man who had reported him. And Hilton spoke like nothing was wrong, as if he had no clue he was the center of a manhunt. He explained, casually, that the reason he'd been slacking at work before was because he'd been sick. But now, he said, he was feeling better, ready to come back to work. His former boss had to think fast. He knew what was at stake. He knew that this call could be the only chance to lead Hilton into police custody without confrontation. So he played along. He told Hilton, "Okay, I'll help you get back on your feet. You can have your job back. I'll even let you stay at one of my houses for a while, just to get things started." This wasn't an empty promise. The man was wealthy, owned multiple properties, and knew how to use that to his advantage. "I'll leave a check for $800 at the house," he said, "just to get you some food, some clothes, whatever you need. You can start your life back up there, and we'll talk about getting you back to work." But of course, the plan was never about the check, because when Gary Hilton would show up to collect it, there'd be a full SWAT team waiting for him. Police would arrest him, and they would have Gary Hilton. That was the plan. Police were ready. They had the house staked out, a full SWAT team hidden nearby, positioned and waiting. This was supposed to be it, the moment they finally caught Gary Hilton. But he never showed up. Hours passed, then days. Nothing. The house stayed empty. No sign of movement, no sign of Hilton. It became clear he must have sensed something was off or simply changed his mind. The trap had failed, so the police shifted focus. They knew Hilton had called his former boss. They just didn't know from where. If they could trace that call, they might get a clearer idea of where Hilton had gone. Was he still in Georgia? Or had he already crossed state lines? Eventually, they got a hit. The call had been placed from a location about 40 miles south of Blood Mountain. It meant Hilton had already moved far from the original crime scene. He was on the move, and fast. Then, for days after Meredith Emerson had disappeared, there was finally a flicker of activity tied directly to her. Her bank card was being used. Several different ATM machines, all miles apart, had recorded attempted withdrawals. Not a single one had worked. The pins entered were incorrect, but the pattern was telling. These weren't random guesses. It looked like someone was trying over and over again and failing. To the investigators, this opened up a possibility they hadn't dared hope for. Maybe Meredith was still alive. Maybe Gary Hilton had her with him in his van, and she was purposely giving him the wrong pins, stalling, trying to survive by buying time. If that was true, then she was fighting, even in the smallest ways, to stay alive. That same evening, another lead came in. A big one. A woman called the police to report something strange. She had found a small black dog wandering alone in a parking lot, scared but unharmed. Thinking it might be someone's lost pet, she took it to a nearby vet to check for a microchip. There was one. It was Ella, Meredith Emerson's dog. The vet scanned the chip, and suddenly this wasn't just a stray anymore. Ella had been found, 60 miles away from Blood Mountain, and she was alone. Police rushed to the area immediately, and while they were processing that new information, another tip came in. Things were moving quickly now, and it was all thanks to the heavy media coverage. This time, the call was from a woman who knew Hilton personally. She said that she'd just received a phone call from him, and during the conversation, he had asked if he could borrow some money. He told her he was running out and needed help. The woman, stunned, had responded, "Don't you know you're the most wanted man in Georgia right now?" There was silence, and then Hilton hung up. Police immediately traced that call too, and this time, it led them to a payphone very close to where Ella had just been found. That gave them something critical: proximity. Hilton was still in the area. He was running low on money. He had lost his dog. He was likely growing desperate. Police headed straight to the parking lot where Ella had been found. They spoke with store employees, scanned the surroundings, and checked surveillance. Then they decided to check the large dumpsters behind the store. Inside, they found Meredith's backpack and blood-stained clothing. They knew it was hers. Her ID was still inside the bag. The moment was sobering. It was the kind of discovery that pulled hope and dread into the same space. She might still be alive, or this might be a sign that she wasn't. Police barely had time to collect the evidence before the next, final, and most important tip came in. 911 received 3 different calls, all coming from a local gas station. Each caller said the same thing. There was a man outside who was acting suspiciously, and he matched the description of the man who had been on the news for the past few days. A white van, a bald man in his 50s or 60s, a red-haired dog, carrying bags and tossing them into the trash. One caller, sounding breathless on the line, was absolutely certain. "I've been watching the news every day. That's him. That's the guy. The one they've been showing. The one they're all looking for." Police wasted no time. They surrounded the gas station, blocked off every exit, and moved in. Officers approached the white van and arrested the man standing next to it. 61-year-old Gary Hilton. They had him, and they had the van. But when they looked inside, Meredith Emerson wasn't there. There were just a lot of bags and rubbish. Once Gary Hilton was finally in custody, police wasted no time. He was immediately taken to the station for questioning. Time was now everything. Meredith was still missing, and every hour that passed felt heavier. Maybe she was still alive. Maybe she was being held somewhere, without food or water. The investigators knew they had to move fast. Every delay could mean the difference between life and death. But Hilton wasn't going to make it easy. As soon as he sat down in the interview room, he invoked the Fifth Amendment. He refused to say anything. No answers. No explanations. Nothing until he had a lawyer. The officers could feel the momentum slipping. It was a gut punch. Not only were they so close to him physically, but they were so far from finding Meredith. And they couldn't afford to wait. So the next morning, 5 days after Meredith disappeared, investigators took what they had and filed charges. Hilton was officially charged with kidnapping and causing bodily injury. The evidence they found in the dumpsters, her blood-stained clothes and ID, was damning. Even without a confession, it told a story. A terrifying one. Eventually, Hilton was appointed a lawyer. And to everyone's surprise, things shifted almost immediately. Hilton made an offer. He said he would plead guilty to everything. The kidnapping, the murder, all of it, as long as the death penalty was taken off the table. That was his one condition. No execution. For the investigators, this was a painful bargain. But they took it. Because if Hilton really had murdered Meredith, they wanted her body back. They wanted to bring her home. And so, Gary Hilton led police to Dawson Forest, just outside of Atlanta. He took them down a specific trail, then off the main path, down a steep embankment thick with leaves and underbrush. There, he pointed to a spot, said her body would be under the brush. He also warned them her head would be missing. So they searched, and they found her, just like he said. While officers were off recovering Meredith's body, Hilton was taken back to the station and placed in an interview room again. He was no longer withholding information. He had confessed, and now the detectives wanted the entire story. From the first moment he saw Meredith to the moment he was caught, they needed to hear it all. So he told them. Hilton said that on New Year's Day, he'd seen Meredith hiking with her dog Ella along a less traveled path on Blood Mountain. He chose that spot on purpose. It was quiet, tucked away. He ambushed her there. But what he didn't expect was that Meredith fought back. She wasn't an easy target. She had training in martial arts. She was strong, fast, and determined not to go down without a fight. Hilton admitted that she managed to disarm him twice, first taking away his police baton, then even managing to wrestle away his bayonet-style knife. They struggled, hand-to-hand, trading blows. At one point, they tumbled down an embankment during the fight, still grappling, still locked in that desperate moment. Eventually, Hilton managed to overpower her long enough to tie her up, securing her to a tree. But he wasn't done yet. He realized he had left his weapons at the original ambush site. Panic set in. If someone found them, they'd trace them back to him. So he climbed back up the hill, searching through leaves and debris, hoping to recover them. He couldn't find them. They were still there, of course, but covered, maybe tossed by Meredith during the struggle. With time running out and a captive below, he gave up. He went back down the trail to where Meredith was still tied. She wasn't screaming. He hadn't gagged her, but she stayed quiet. Hilton told her he had a gun. He said that if she made a sound, he would shoot her. Truthfully, he didn't have a firearm at all, but Meredith had no way of knowing that. She stayed silent. Then he dragged her through the forest, down back trails, and eventually to his white van. He opened the back, forced her inside, and secured her with chains. Hilton's next move was all about money. He demanded her car keys, then went to her parked car to retrieve her bank cards. Once he had them, he left the trailhead and drove miles away, 12 miles north to be exact. He wasn't going to risk being caught anywhere near Blood Mountain. He went to an ATM, entered the PIN she'd given him, and didn't work. Frustrated, Hilton returned to the van, questioning her. Meredith calmly insisted she had given the correct number. Maybe, she said, it was the ATM that wasn't working. Maybe they should just try a different one. That was her plan all along. She was buying time, stalling, hoping that someone would realize she was gone, hoping police would come and find her. After the failed attempt at the first ATM, Gary Hilton didn't give up. Instead, he drove another 50 miles, this time to Gainesville, hoping that maybe a different machine would work. He tried the same PIN number Meredith had given him, the one she had clearly made up to buy herself time. Unsurprisingly, it didn't work. Again, by now it was getting late. Hilton didn't want to risk drawing attention by continuing to drive from ATM to ATM in the middle of the night, especially with someone chained up in the back of his van. So instead of pushing further, he pulled over near a wooded area and began setting up a makeshift campsite. It wasn't a real shelter, just a spot in the woods where they could stay hidden. It's believed Hilton didn't have a permanent home. He was living out of his van, drifting between campgrounds, parks, and trailheads. But now he had Meredith with him, and she couldn't stay in a van. So he created a crude second campsite just for her, a place out of view, out of reach. And he left her tied up the entire time. No freedom of movement, no chance of escape. The next morning, Hilton got up, packed his things, and drove another 40 miles, this time to Canton. Yet again, he tried the same fake PIN Meredith had given him. Yet again, it didn't work. And yet, he still seemed to believe her. Or maybe he was in denial, desperate, refusing to accept that he'd been outsmarted. But that morning, Hilton made a decision that changed everything. He left Meredith behind. He didn't bring her to the ATM with him. He just left her there at that hidden camp in the woods, alone, tied up, vulnerable. And that's where she stayed for the next 4 days. Imagine that. For full days in the cold, bound and isolated, not knowing if anyone would ever find her. She'd been brave, calm, even strategic. She tried to stay alive, tried to keep herself useful, but she must have known time was running out. At some point during those 4 days, Hilton realized he had another problem. Ella? She hadn't eaten. She was barking, restless, hungry, and her barking could attract attention. Attention Hilton couldn't afford. He told police later that he knew what he should have done. He said outright, he knew he probably should have killed Ella. She likely had a microchip. If she were found, it would link back to Meredith. It would expose everything. But Hilton didn't do it. He said, and these were his exact words, that he was too much of a softie to kill a dog. So instead, he put Ella in the van, drove to a parking lot, let her out, and drove away. The contradiction wasn't lost on investigators. They challenged him on it. You couldn't kill a dog, they said, but you had no problem murdering Meredith? Or Cheryl? Or possibly others? Hilton's answer was chilling. He told them that Meredith was doomed from the start, that he had known from the moment he decided to ambush her that he couldn't let her go. He said he had two options: kill her or get caught. And once the kidnapping happened, the choice, in his mind, had already been made. He wasn't going to take the risk of letting her identify him. But he also told them something strange, something that suggested, at least for a moment, he might have considered letting her go. He said he told Meredith, "I'm going to go back to the van. I'll get the pliers. I'll cut you out of your ties. I'll let you go." Maybe he meant it, or maybe it was just another manipulation, a false promise to lower her guard. It's impossible to know, because instead of grabbing pliers, Hilton picked up a tire iron. He returned to Meredith and bludgeoned her to death. And after she was gone, he wasn't finished. Knowing how forensics could identify DNA, knowing how fingerprints or hair or even skin cells could link him to the crime, he decapitated her, then poured bleach over her body. He wanted to destroy any trace that she'd ever been in contact with him. Now that they had a full confession from Gary Hilton that he had kidnapped and murdered Meredith Emerson, there was finally a sense of resolution, at least for that part of the story. But what about Cheryl Dunlap? What about John and Irene Bryant? That was where Hilton drew the line. He was willing, even eager, to talk about Meredith. He described every detail, every decision, every dark moment. But the second the conversation turned toward any other victim, he shut down. Not a word, not even a reaction, no acknowledgement, no denied, just silence. And without a confession or solid forensic evidence, police couldn't charge him with anything else. All they had were similarities, patterns, suspicion. But in the world of the law, that's not enough. They needed proof. So, officially, Hilton would only be held responsible for one life, Meredith Emerson's. In January 2008, just weeks after his arrest, Gary Hilton appeared in court. Just like he had agreed in his plea deal, he pleaded guilty to all charges related to Meredith's abduction and murder. The court sentenced him to the maximum possible punishment: life in prison without the possibility of parole, but no death penalty, as promised. It was a victory, but not a complete one, because the investigators didn't believe Meredith was his only victim. Far from it. They believed that Gary Hilton was a serial predator, and they wanted to prove it, to hold him accountable for more than just one life. They decided to dig deeper than ever before. They went all the way back to his childhood, hoping to find early signs, clues, anything that might explain how this man became who he was. What they found was disturbing. At just 14 years old, Gary Hilton shot his stepfather. The man didn't die, but the injury was severe. And despite the seriousness of the act, Hilton wasn't sent to juvenile detention or prison. Instead, he was committed to a mental institution, a sign, even back then, that something was seriously wrong beneath the surface. Years later, Hilton enlisted in the U.S. Army. His fascination with violence and weapons didn't fade. In fact, it seemed to thrive. He would later brag to police with pride that he had handled atomic weapons during his time in service. Whether or not that was true didn't seem to matter to him. It was the image, the power, the control. And it wasn't just the things Hilton did that disturbed police. It was how he spoke. He wasn't erratic. He wasn't incoherent. He was sharp, calculated, intelligent, narcissistic. It's been documented that Hilton had a very high IQ, though the exact number wasn't widely shared. But officers could feel in how he talked. He had the kind of intelligence that was manipulative, like a classic case out of a psychology textbook. The type of man who could talk in circles, twist your words, make you forget what question you were even asking. He played games in the interview room, reverse psychology, baiting the detectives. Whenever they brought up the other victims, Cheryl Dunlap, the Bryants, Hilton would smirk and say things like, "If you guys want to spend millions of dollars trying to prove I did something when I'm already locked up for life, go ahead. If you want to try and get me the death penalty, I'll be dead soon enough anyway." It was posturing, a defense disguised as indifference. But it was clear what he was trying to do: stay alive. Still, investigators couldn't ignore the way everything lined up. Take Cheryl Dunlap, for instance. A woman alone, hiking, disappears, later found decapitated and mutilated, just like Meredith. It was the exact same method of killing, the same strategy to avoid identification. And the timing? It was perfectly aligned. First came John and Irene Bryant. Then, 2 months later, it was Cheryl. And less than a month after that, it was Meredith Emerson. It was starting to look like Gary Hilton couldn't stop. Like something inside him was always building an urge, a compulsion, a kind of addiction to the act of killing itself. The timeline of his alleged crimes was growing tighter and more alarming. John and Irene Bryant, then Cheryl Dunlap, then Meredith Emerson, all within a span of just a few months. It wasn't escalating, it was spiraling. The police, now desperate to pin down more than just Meredith's murder, began releasing more information to the media about Cheryl and the Bryants. They hoped the coverage would trigger new memories, tips, anything that could link Hilton more directly to the other victims. And it worked. People began calling in individuals who had been near the trail where Cheryl went missing, hikers who'd crossed paths with her. Piece by piece, police were able to build a clearer timeline of Cheryl's final day. One caller remembered seeing her that morning, sitting alone on a bench at the side of the trail, reading a book. Calm, peaceful, just enjoying the fresh air like she always did. That bench was on a small, named trail, a detail that would become crucial. Because then another tip came in. It wasn't directly about Cheryl, but it was about that exact same trail. This time, someone reported seeing a red-haired dog walking that route, weeks before Cheryl disappeared. That might not sound like much, except we already know whose dog that was. Gary Hilton's. It placed him clearly and specifically on the same trail Cheryl was last seen, just weeks before her death. With this new lead, officers decided to go back to the scene. Now that they knew exactly where Cheryl had been, they began combing the surrounding area. Every tree, every clearing, every hidden path. And just 5 miles away from where Cheryl's body had been discovered, they found something. It was a makeshift campfire site, mostly reduced to ash. But in the ash were charred human bones, fragments of a skull and hands. The very parts Cheryl had been missing when she was found. They were too badly burned for DNA testing. There was no scientific way to confirm identity. But logically, it was clear. Cheryl's head and hands had never been recovered, and now here they were, or what was left of them, just a short hike away. Still, logic wasn't enough. This didn't tie the remains directly to Gary Hilton. It looked right. It felt right. But the investigators needed something definitive. So they went back to the beginning, back to Hilton's van. When it was first seized at the time of his arrest, police had searched it thoroughly. They found a camera and several SD cards. At the time, they browsed through one or two. Nothing had jumped out, some random footage, scenery, maybe a few personal clips. They assumed he just liked to record his travels. But now, with new suspicions and stronger motive, they revisited those cards. This time, they dug deeper. They used forensic software to recover deleted files, audio, video, anything that had once been on those memory cards. And then they found something. It was an audio clip recorded just 2 days after Cheryl Dunlap went missing. In the clip, Hilton could be heard talking to his dog, Dandy. His tone was casual, almost like he was making small talk. "We're doing it, boy. Just killed those bitch. Gotta go to the park now." "Yeah, but first I gotta hide it somewhere else." He said it like someone talking about the weather. Not a whisper of remorse. Just logistics. And that wasn't all. Detectives then revisited the earliest physical evidence from Cheryl's case. Her car, which had been found on the side of the highway. They remembered how the tire had been slashed, and at the time, forensic experts had said it looked like a puncture made by a specific weapon. Something long, narrow, and sharp. Like a bayonet. And now, weeks later, at the scene of Meredith Emerson's murder, what had police found? A bayonet buried in the dirt, almost lost beneath the leaves. Gary Hilton later confirmed it was his. The final nail in the coffin came from forensics. Investigators took the bayonet recovered from the Meredith Emerson crime scene, the one Gary Hilton admitted belonged to him, and compared it directly to the puncture wound on Cheryl Dunlap's tire. Forensic experts examined the angle, the depth, the striations along the cut. And what they found was decisive. The shape and pattern of the damage matched perfectly. That specific bayonet had created the slash on Cheryl's tire. The weapon used in both cases was now definitively tied to Hilton. But that wasn't all. Now that Cheryl's body had been fully recovered, forensic teams went further. They ran DNA tests on nearly every personal item in Hilton's possession: his clothing, his equipment, the contents of his van, and on 2 of his sleeping bags, as well as the shoelaces of his hiking boots. They found Cheryl Dunlap's DNA. That was the evidence they had been waiting for. With the new forensic findings, Gary Hilton was brought to trial, this time for the murder of Cheryl Dunlap. And once again, the jury found him guilty, not only of her murder, but of a long list of charges: preventing a proper burial, tampering with evidence, interfering with justice, each charge echoing the cruelty and calculated nature of his crimes. But this time, there was no plea deal, no bargaining, no deal to take the death penalty off the table. The prosecution didn't need it. The evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated not just on his guilt, but on what punishment should follow. They considered the sheer brutality of the acts, the repetition, the growing list of possible victims. And though they couldn't confirm it in court, they knew about the Bryant couple. They knew about the similarities, the patterns, the disturbing precision. So the jury made a decision they believed was in the public's best interest. Gary Hilton was sentenced to death for the murder of Cheryl Dunlap. After the verdict, he was transferred to a different prison facility, and soon after, police formally charged him with the murders of John and Irene Bryant as well. But that case has never gone to trial, and honestly, it probably never will. He's already on death row. What else could a court do to him? While those 4 murders, Meredith Emerson, Cheryl Dunlap, John Bryant, and Irene Bryant, are the only officially confirmed victims, Hilton is suspected to have killed many more. Hikers go missing all the time. Sometimes it's accidents. Sometimes it's nature. But in Georgia, there have been too many disappearances that seem too familiar. Take Raison Emiliana, 26 years old. She was last seen entering a small shop with an older man, bald, late 50s to early 60s. The shopkeeper said she seemed anxious, uncomfortable. Her body was later discovered on a hiking trail, badly beaten. Her bank card had been stolen, and someone had tried to use it multiple times, but no one was ever charged. No suspects named. Or Michael Scott Lewis, 27. He also vanished while out hiking. When his body was eventually found, it was decapitated. Other body parts were missing as well. Once again, no arrest. No justice. Same method of killing. Same profile of victim. Same geographic patterns. No formal connection to Hilton, at least not yet, but those names come up again and again whenever his name is searched. And then there's the chilling thought, the one that lingers long after the files are closed. How many others are there? How many victims never got identified? Never found? Because hiking trails are vast. Forests stretch for miles. Nature grows thick and wild and silent. And it's easy, horrifyingly easy, for a body to disappear there and never be seen again. So imagine how many people go missing. They might not just be missing. They might have been murdered. As of right now, Gary Hilton is still alive. He sits on death row, awaiting execution, a man whose crimes span mountains, states, and years, and yet whose full scope may never truly be known. And I guess I'll keep you updated if that ever changes. Personally, I believe, like many do, that Gary Hilton had far more victims than the 4 he's been officially charged with. The patterns, the locations, the gaps in the timeline, it all points to something bigger. There's a certain darkness to him, a compulsion that doesn't just start and stop over the course of a few months. It builds over time. It festers. And those 2 possible victims, Raison Emiliana and Michael Scott Lewis, they might just be the tip of something we can't yet see. Let me know what you think down below. Because one thing's for sure, Hilton clearly liked to travel. He spent time in Florida, North Carolina, Georgia, and who knows where else. I'll admit I don't know American geography all that well, so I can't say exactly how far apart all those states are. But honestly, if he was willing to cross state lines for one murder, it makes you wonder, how many missing or dead hikers are out there? that he's just never been connected to?